One of the excuses that communists use to justify the failures of this ideology in the 20th century is the lack of scale. That if communism had spread to the most of the world, and especially to the rich industrialized countries of Europe and the United States, it would have succeeded. Well, let's give them a chance, so to speak. Welcome to the Synthetic History channel, where we talk about events that didn't happen as if they did. And in this video we will see what will happen to the world of HOI4 with the road to 56 months. If every country with focuses tried to take the left paths. And for more interest in the Soviet Union, the birthplace of the revolution, the power will be changed to an alternative communist one. And I will tell you about all the stupid things done by the AI and come up with explanations for them in the form of role-playing historical narrative. Mocking the main drawback of communism, the economy, obviously will not work, because the industry in HOI can consist solely of military factories, and everyone in the country will be fine. But we have what we have. Red World in Hearts of Iron 4. The story began in the year 1919. On March 4 of that year, an international organization of leftists was founded in Moscow, the Third International, aka the Comintern. As Lenin said at the first Comintern Congress, a union of workers all over the world, striving for the establishment of Soviet power in all countries. This organization gave the USSR the ability to lead and sponsor communist parties in other countries, being in essence a focal point and exporter of leftist ideas outside the homeland of the revolution. Let's move forward 17 years. By 1936, the number of communist countries in the world had not really increased, so one could conclude that the Comintern was doing a poor job. From that year, however, things began to change dramatically. The first warning bell was the events in Paraguay. There, in February, there was a coup. The military tried to overthrow President Eusebio Ayala. And there would have been nothing unusual in this. Military coups in South America happened regularly. But the coup failed, and civil war broke out in the country. Moreover, Ayala for some reason abruptly changed the political course of the country and announced the construction of communism on the Marxist model. The people supported him, and by July the communists had defeated the military. And there will be a lot of such sudden changes in political courses, coups and revolutions in the next 4 years. I would even say too many. The next 4 years will be called Red Noon and Red Plague in communist and non-communist countries respectively. So, why did I start the story with the Comintern? Well, the thing is that all future events could not have developed independently of each other at the same time. I mean, people and politicians all over the world can't suddenly become left-wing, right? There has to be someone behind them, and the Comintern is the only option here. And although the involvement of the USSR in most of the events could not be proved, the documents related to them were either burned, which I will talk about later, or destroyed. There are simply no other options. Well, there is another option, that it was Trotskyists, but it is rather perceived as conspiracy. Therefore, I will specify the events where the involvement of the USSR is proven. In June in Ethiopia, which had been successfully repelling the Italian invasion for more than half a year, there was a successful coup organized by the Black Alliance, a paramilitary organization of anarcho-communists. Having usurped power, they began to defeudalize the country and continued to fight off the Italians quite successfully, concluding a status quo truce with them the following year. The events in Ethiopia and Paraguay were nevertheless unnoticed. Nobody actually cared about them. But when the British government bent to the demands of the trade unions, in which more than half of British workers were members, and which were connected to the British Bureau of the Red International of Trade Unions, Comintern, a subsidiary organization of the Comintern, everybody again paid attention to the communist threat. And the demands were not small. In addition to economic concessions, they included decolonization and the gradual weakening of the powers of the House of Lords. There was a clear trend towards the strengthening of leftist sentiment in society. To Britain we will return later. Now let's talk about Germany. In August, Berlin hosted the Summer Olympics, at the time the most pompous and well-attended games in history, with around 4 million fans from 49 countries within Germany. The Third Reich showed its strength and hospitality, and foreigners had a good impression of Germany, and Nazis would yet need it. One such foreigner was a Brit who decided to stay in Germany a little longer. And in September, he stabbed German Chancellor Adolf Hitler to death, using his stabbing license. Bit sad, innit? Hitler became a kind of martyr for the German people, and his replacement as head of state, Hermann Göring, blamed Britain and France for the incident. Only years later did it become clear that the guy was acting on a Soviet plan. Hitler's assassination led to the destabilization of the Nazi regime, which however still had a lot of popular support, consequently leading to the German Civil War in November. The third party to the conflict, in addition to the Nazis and the Communists, was a coalition of Democrats and the military, who were dissatisfied with the policies of the Nazis. Initially, the Democrats and Communists were planned to unite, because individually they were weaker than the government. But shortly before the uprising, the military refused to cooperate with the Communists. This put them at a major disadvantage in the conflict. Not only were they pretty badly hurt by the purges of the previous years, but geographically they were sandwiched between the other two sides, like between hammer and anvil. So they began to suffer defeats and went on the defensive. The involvement of the Soviet Union was also proven in two revolutions in the Baltic states, Estonia and Latvia. And that was only because the revolution in Estonia was defeated. In some countries, though, communists collaborated with Democrats. In the Spanish Civil War, for example, they fought together quite successfully against nationalists and monarchists. But communism began to raise its head not only in Europe. In China, at the time, communists under Mao Zedong, who had been driven into the mountains, started a war against 3 cliques of Ma family warlords. Taking advantage of this war, other Chinese communists in Xinjiang, virtually protectorate of the USSR, started a war against Afghanistan. In Japan, previously the main threat to China, the unthinkable happened at that time. The Communist Party of Japan gained the support of junior and middle officers, and, having achieved the rotation of ardent sympathizers of the imperial power to Manchuria, started a revolution. In Mexico, the local government began to implement social reforms, and the paramilitary organization of the Red Guards was gaining strength, which caused a backlash from the traditionally strong Mexican church and the Democrats. The civil war against the latter was led by Victoriano Alvarez, a writer who had already been dead for 5 years. In Brazil at this time there was a successful communist putsch against the oligarchic regime of Getúlio Vargas. Brazil and Paraguay would later unite to form the American International, sort of independent of the Comintern. A couple months earlier, a syndicalist coup had occurred in France, in mass demonstrations by workers. I will not explain in detail what kind of system this is, only explain the main difference between them and the Marxist-Leninists/Stalinists. If the latter strive for the dictatorship of the proletariat through a one-party democratic system, how much such a one-party system can be democratic is another question. As well as on the bureaucracy, roughly speaking, building socialism through the state. The syndicalists tried to control the state through the association of trade unions and cooperates of workers, controlling the means of production. At the same time, another international was founded in Paris, this time the Fourth International, led by Trotskyists and Trotsky himself. Apart from the obvious desires for power and revenge against Stalin, Trotsky was driven by the desire to build the right socialism, because, in his opinion, the path that the USSR was taking at the time led to the abyss, specifically back to capitalism. I will tell you what Trotsky came up with later. For now, let's move on to 1937. In January in Hungary, under the guidance of Soviet agents, there was an assassination of regent without king Miklos Horthy and the subsequent putsch of communists. At the end of March, the civil war broke out in Italy. The truce with Ethiopia, with this bunch of barbarian anarchists with spears, actually meant the defeat of Italy in the war, showed the failure of Mussolini's regime, and had an extremely negative impact on his popularity, which gave the Coalition of Liberation the chance to raise a rebellion, which ended with the victory of the rebels in October. In May, realizing the danger of rising communist sentiment in Scandinavia, the Swedes announced the formation of the Nordic Defense Council and began a war against communist Denmark and their former colony of Iceland. In June, almost as communist Honduras attacked Guatemala, a war that would drag on for a long time. Further north, in Mexico, a civil war ended with a socialist victory. 6 months later, Alvarez handed over power to the Soviet government and went back to the grave. In July, the Chinese communists defeated the Maklists, and the Japanese communists gained full control of the archipelago. The victory of the latter had a negative impact on the former, since the Japanese Empire, which had been the main threat to the whole of China, had virtually liquidated itself. There was nothing to prevent the main player in China, the Republic of China led by Chiang Kai-shek, from uniting the region by force. Moreover, against the backdrop of the growth of communism in Japan, the situation in China was the opposite. National sentiments were growing there, and the blue-shirt society began to gain power. They started a war against Mao's communists, and the latter were expectedly defeated. Let's move to Spain. By the end of the year, the balance of power had completely changed there. If before the Republicans were pushing the nationalists, then with the revolt of the anarcho-syndicalists of Aragon, supported by France, things became bad for the Democrats. They quite quickly occupied all the territories controlled by the Republicans, and when there was a split in the camp of nationalists and monarchists, it was they who became the most powerful force in the civil war. Now look what was happening in the Middle East. In Afghanistan and Iran, there were communist coups, revolutions, inspired by the USSR, never happened before. In the former, it was relatively bloodless, but in the latter, the coup led to a civil war. But pro-monarchist forces were in an absolute minority there. However, imagine there were cases when socialists came to power during elections. Such a miracle, for example, happened in Turkey. After the resignation of Atatürk, who, under the influence of the growing popularity of the ideas of communism in Europe, began to pursue a so far imperceptible socialist policy. His successor Ismet Inonu, such a true socialist, was elected president. In Palestine, as part of the British decolonization process, the Jerusalem Conference was held at this time, according to which Israel and Palestine were gaining independence, and the city of Jerusalem itself was destroyed. I mean, it was given under the control of the League of Nations, so as not to upset anyone. But I have not yet thought about the main event of the year, namely the civil war in the USSR. By the fall, the Trotskyists planned to create the main center of anti-Stalinist resistance in the territory of the Union was successfully implemented. This hotbed was Ukraine. There, after the artificial mass famine of 1932-33, which killed several million people, the share of sympathizers of Stalin's policy fell quite a lot, and the access to the sea there was the most convenient. And in general, from the beginning of the year, in the Soviet Union began a kind of turbulence. Stalin, who before death was characterized by distrust of his entourage, fellow party members, military, well, in short, to the entire top of the Union, and therefore conducted their purges. After the creation of the Trotskyist Force International, completely fell into paranoia. As it turned out later, not for nothing, but here we should not confuse cause and effect. It was Stalin's policy that led to the defection of many party members and army officers to the Trotskyists, because it is better to do something and be shot than be innocent and still be shot. Since the summer, the scale of the purges has also changed. If earlier the purges mainly were open show trials of the elite, now they have expanded, so to speak, to all classes. Under the secret order of the NKVD of the USSR number 00447 began repression of anti-Soviet or other anti-Stalinist elements among common people. And so Trotskyist supporters were all over the country. First, about 200,000 people from international troops landed in the ports of Odessa, Sevastopol and Mariupol. Then they were joined by defectors from the Red Army, about 500,000 more people, and the Trotskyist workers and peasants militia numbering 300,000 people. The pro-Stalin contingent totaled only 600,000 men, and therefore began to suffer rapid defeats. In addition, mini putches began to take place in many of the major cities of the Union, diverting Stalinist forces from the main front. The war lasted 6 months and ended with the fall of Moscow. At the same time, as a result of a large-scale fire in the city center, most of the documents were lost. At least so the new authorities claimed. Now Trotsky and his lads had an opportunity for reform. What did Trotsky promise? The main differences between Trotskyism and Stalinism are two things. the reduced role of the bureaucracy, and the theory of permanent revolution. The Stalinist bureaucracy, represented by one party, in the creation of which, by the way, Trotsky himself participated, had too much power and privileges, and therefore it is necessary to create several parties, competing in elections with each other for the votes of the people. The parties should naturally all be left-wing, even like this, I guess. The theory of permanent revolution, on the other hand, was that socialism could not be built in one country, and therefore communism had to be exported around the world. Stalin probably wanted to spread communism too, and did so, but he declared socialism in one country. And now, it would seem, an ideal situation for communism. At that moment, half of the world was already under the control of governments that were in one way or another leftists. And in the other half, primarily we are interested in Great Britain and the United States. The leftists were only getting stronger. All that remained was to agree on the creation of a confederation and make all non-socialists socialists, leaving the opinion of the bourgeoisie unasked. However, everything was not so simple. There were quite a few kinds of leftism. Marxism and its branches, syndicalism, anarchism, social democracy, workers' Zionism, Arab socialism, national socialism, and so on. And each of these isms had its own vision of the future. The communists in Greece, for example, decided to help their neighbors in Bulgaria, where a communist coup was already brewing, and went to war against them, successfully turning them into their puppet. Because of this war, or rather because of the failure to stop it, by the way, the League of Nations, an organization on the basis of which it was quite realistic to create a global socialist confederation, actually stopped its work. Or, for example, we can look at the case of Scandinavia. There, at the beginning of 1939, on the initiative of recently communist Finland, the Northern Defense Council of Socialist States was established. It included all Scandinavian countries, but since Sweden could not agree on peace with Denmark and Iceland, it was kicked out of the alliance and together declared war on it, eventually replacing the government of Social Democrats with Marxists. But those were local conflicts, and more serious problems began to emerge when in November 1939, just 3 months after the end of the German Civil War, Göring declared war on France and Poland, which had signed a mutual defense pact for the return of the lands of the German Empire. While France tried unsuccessfully to breach German border fortifications, German troops focused on Poland, which was able to mount a successful offensive early in the war, and captured East Prussia. But then the Poles began to suffer defeats, and in May 1939, Warsaw fell. The course of the war could have been reversed by the entry of the USSR, or rather the USR, but Trotsky refused to help bourgeois Poland, and planned to liberate it from the occupation after its complete defeat. France and Poland united in the alliance Humanité Unie, translated from the French as United Humanity. Italy and Iran would later join the alliance, followed by Belgium, where revolutionaries had King Leopold III executed. A fairly rare situation for the time. Usually they were either just stripped of their title or exiled somewhere. The next hope for the world communism was the United States. In February, in response to growing leftist sentiment and the federal government's policy of desegregation, the southeastern states attempted to succeed for the second time. The Second Civil War began, and ended in the same way as the previous one, with the victory of the North. In the special presidential election after the war, the candidate of the Communist Party of USA, Earl Browder, won. They intended to build democratic socialism, and unlike Trotskyism, agreed to compete in elections against the entire political spectrum. By the time, the British Empire had completely, or almost completely, finished the process of decolonization, and Marxists had taken power in government and parliament. Now, all but one major countries with a large proportion of proletariat became leftist. However, events began to take a radically opposite course from the expected one. Expected for contemporaries, at least in Europe, was an alliance against Germany. But in the US, people were concerned not about German aggression, but about the lack of decolonization by France, and so declared war on their colony of Indochina. Déjà vu. France itself wasn't innocent either, not even counting the delay in decolonization. When decolonization took place in the Union of Britain, aka the former United Kingdom, some non-Englanders on the eponymous Isle wanted succession, but according to the referendums, the only part that wanted succession was Northern Ireland, 62% in favor. Scotland had the second highest proportion of successionists at 44%. Quite a lot actually. Hence, when there was a rebellion there, no one was surprised. The surprise came when France recognized the independence of Scotland and invited them to its alliance, and as it turned out later, supported the organization of this rebellion. Effectively, it was a declaration of war. And what happened next? The US allied with Britain because they were both at war with France. And you know who else was at war with France? The Third Reich. So from 1940, the conflict in Europe became a new world war, and gradually began to reach the pace of destruction of people for which it is actually known. The beginning of that year was full of important events. The Northern Alliance started a war against the Soviet Union, believing that the latter would sooner or later attack them themselves. They even managed to capture the former Leningrad, which was renamed back to Petrograd as part of a program to combat cults of personality of party figures. Turkey joined the Fourth International. The anarchists, who had previously won the civil war and attacked Portugal, I forgot to tell you about it because of the chaos, had completely conquered Iberia. Now the whole peninsula became a field of experimentation of anarchism. France's sudden weakness was taken advantage of by China, which invaded Indochina. By the time, China had fully united under the Comintern and Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang Kai-shek himself, however, did not believe that China was fully united, and wanted to come to the borders of the Qin Empire before the century of humiliation. To accomplish this, China launched a war against Mongolia and the Union in April. And these wars were quite successful for China, and quite bloody. In the war in this region, total casualties of military alone amounted to 30 million. But China had a lot of people. The mobilization potential was over 100 million, and the value of life was not high, so there was no problem with that. And even wars with Japan and Australia, which fearing for their safety joined the Fourth International, did not interfere much. What did interfere was the terrible Siberian infrastructure and weak navy, which slowed down the pace of the war a lot. But it is what it is. Back to Europe. Having occupied Poland, Göring thought it would be too difficult to attack France through the Maginot Line, so he attacked the Netherlands and Belgium, hoping to bypass the fortifications from the north. With the support of the US troops that arrived in Germany, they invaded these countries. But it progressed so poorly, and after the departure of US troops, so stopped altogether. Britain at this time was suppressing another rebellion, this time in Wales. Another uprising took place in Northern Ireland. Local communists did not like the fact that the rest of Ireland refused to be communist, and started a revolution. Democratic Ireland, oddly enough, was supported by Britain, so Ireland entered the war and dealt with the rebels pretty quickly. Then the British landed in Normandy, opening a new front, and in May they took Paris. However, having occupied about half of the country, they could not move forward at the same speed as before. By mid-year, the Northern Alliance began to suffer defeats, and by October, with the surrender of Finland, all of Scandinavia fell into the Soviet sphere of influence, without even suffering a change in leadership. What was this war for, then? Well, the communists seemed to have more respect for the Soviet Union after it seems. Mercy was rare at the time. Anyway, against the backdrop of an ever-increasing war in the world, the non-communist countries of the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Jordan, Palestine and Israel, joined together in the Jerusalem Pact. Thus, the Arab-Israeli conflict was ended, or rather suspended. In November, the anarchists of Iberia allied with Peru, where the Bourbon dynasty had come to power in a civil war. Yep, anarchists and monarchists. I can't think of a more cursed combination. They are literally in opposite places on the political compass. But it happened. And the only thing they had in common was that both countries were pariahs. the monarchy, much less drawing legitimacy from the colonial period in post-Bolivar South America, and the anarchists. Well, they've always been the unwanted child, probably since the Neolithic age. Both of them also spoke Spanish, but by that logic the number of wars in Latin America would be much less. Okay, enough jokes for now. These guys entered the World War when Peru attacked Bolivia, and the US entered that war. There was also vanguardist Chile in the alliance, but after winning the civil war they left it, and Peru retaliated by starting a war against them. Chile became part of the Chinese Fascist Alliance. In early 1941, another alliance in Latin America was formed by Mexico and Argentina, who did not want to join the Brazilian International, thus recognizing their leadership in the region. Mexico started a war against Guatemala, and then against the US, calling them traitors to the cause of socialism, taking advantage of the departure of most of the US army to Europe. At first, they moved north very steadily. By the end of the year, they had fully occupied Texas, remember the Alamo, and were standing on the outskirts of Los Angeles. However, the difference between the economies of these countries was so high that the US, even without putting the economy on war footing, which they did only in March 1943, was able to defend itself, and after militarization to launch a counter-offensive. 1941-42 in Europe were the time of sunset for the united humanity. France and Italy were suffering more and more defeats on the fronts, and after the USSR attacked Romania and its entry into the alliance, things became even worse. The situation was slightly improved by dragging Czechoslovakia into the war, which diverted German troops, but it was only a delay for the inevitable. In September, the latter entered Rome, and the following year, the French army was so exhausted that it began to quickly surrender territory, retreating to the east, and by March signed an act of surrender. After it, the rest of the alliance did the same, and with the withdrawal of Italy in October, the entire united humanity came to an end, symbolically. Italy itself, still a few months defending itself in Africa, managed to drag into the war a bunch of countries in Africa and beyond. And here perhaps it is necessary to tell how these countries appeared in general, and what was happening in Africa at the time. In 1940, France started the process of decolonization. Not that it helped them to make peace, and the decolonization itself was incomplete, because the French retained significant influence in the newly formed countries because of support in building socialism. And these countries were quickly conquered, mainly by Brazil, which entered the war when their ally Hungary started the war against Romania. It also declared war on Austria. Britain's former colonies, by the way, were completely free and mostly remained neutral, although just like French ones were sliced up according to former colonial administrative divisions. And those who joined the Italian alliance were the former colonies of Portugal. A rather funny story happened to them. When Portugal was taken over by anarchists, its government and those who did not want to live in a non-state, led by Salazar, moved to the colonies, intending to build a new Portuguese identity there. But the anarchists intervened again, this time Ethiopian, and in the colonies with their support, I don't know with what, spears, I guess, there were rebellions that could not be suppressed. After these uprisings, by October 1942, Portugal had only the Azores, Madeira and Goa, and the former colonies, together with Ethiopia, went to the Italian alliance, and together with this alliance, in early 1943, capitulated and were divided into spheres of influence of the victors. Under the peace treaties, France and Italy were annexed by Britain and Germany. The US and the USSR did the smarter thing, and in their spheres of influence made the defeated countries conditionally independent socialist republics. The next 6 months were spent in the anarchists' war with Germany, with mixed success for both sides, Greece's entry into the World War, and the conquest of Switzerland and Hungary. Big problems for the Third Reich began when the USSR broke the absolutely useless in those conditions non-aggression pact and started a new war. And if we take into account that Britain, realizing the mistake made in making an alliance with the former, went to the side of the latter, joining the Fourth International, the exhausted Germany had no chance. After a couple of months of intense fighting, the Germans began to suffer defeats on land and sea, surrendering occupied territories. In May 1944, Soviet troops landed in the north of the country and entered Berlin, and in August Germany signed an act of surrender. Shortly before their defeat, Trotsky, at a congress of the Fourth International, called on all communists to stop fight each other, unite against their main capitalists and imperialists, and finish the world revolution at last. The only major non-communist state at the time was China, and it could only be defeated by joint efforts. First of all, this appeal was directed to the American continent, where communists were still actively fighting among themselves. But no one listened to him at the time. In June of the following year, the alliance of Mexico and Argentina capitulated, and it turned out that North and South America were controlled by different warring alliances. And the situation seemed stalemate, until the world was struck by the news that the US dropped a nuclear bomb on the capital of Haiti, Port-au-Prince. Although the event was terrible and indicative, it did not bring any changes in the balance of power, because there was only one bomb, and their production had yet to be established. This, for example, did not prevent the British in their landing on the east coast of the United States. They even managed to take New York by the end of the year. Of course, they were not able to advance much further, and in 1947 they were knocked out of the continent. But they destroyed the illusion that the USA was impregnable. Changes began to come only in the 1950s, when the nuclear weapons became more plentiful and began to appear in Britain and the Soviet Union, and then in China. The fear of the nuclear war was increasing, which in turn nullified the situation in which China, with the largest mobilization resource, could simply break the resistance of the rest of Eurasia. And after all, the casualties in this war in military personnel alone amounted to about 100 million people, plus local wars like the War of Egypt against the Jerusalem Pact, or the War of Anarchists against Greece and Bulgaria. People were getting tired of the endless war. The world gradually began to realize the need for peace. The communists began to realize the need for unity, and the need to end the world revolution by non-military methods, such as economic. But peace treaties and the post-war world order is a topic for another story, and I would like to end this story here. Well, that's what the communist world and World War II would have been like if countries were ruled by not very sane scripted AIs, incapable of making peace treaties, and if the economy was factories building other factories. Wouldn't really want to live in that world, but it is what it is. Subscribe to the channel if you want to see more videos like this, check out my other videos if you're new here, and don't forget about likes and comments. And with that, I bid you farewell.